My name is Calliope, Callie Arden. I'm 27, and I never imagined that money could turn my family into strangers overnight. I grew up in the quiet suburbs of Madison, Wisconsin, in a house that smelled of cinnamon rolls and old books, raised by my single mom after my father vanished one January night without a word. Life had always been simple, predictable, like a song on repeat. I worked at a small bookstore, barely scraping by, and spent my evenings dreaming of bigger cities and bigger lives, but I never expected to be pulled into a nightmare by my own blood. My niece, Sylvie Lancaster, the 13-year-old daughter of my older brother who I hadn't spoken to in years, had won $9 million in the state lottery. It wasn't just the money, it was how she used it. She erased our family, one name at a time, as though the bonds we had shared were nothing but chalk lines in the dirt, ready to be wiped away with the back of her hand. The first text I received from her said, "You're not welcome here anymore." I remember staring at the screen, my coffee spilling over the counter, my hands trembling. I had no idea how a child could wield such power with a cruel precision that felt older than time. But then, just 72 hours later, she needed me. Needed my secret. And I realized that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. Sylvie had always been smart. Impossibly so. Even at 5, she had a way of reading people, noticing what scared them, what they wanted to hide. My brother used to laugh nervously whenever she interrogated him about finances or his dating life, calling it Sylvie's little FBI training. But I had always been on the other side, a distant aunt who occasionally bought her a candy bar or read her a bedtime story when her father was too busy with work or his failed marriages. She looked at me differently. She trusted me in ways that scared me because I could see the calculating mind behind those wide blue eyes. And now, with $9 million, she had the leverage to make everyone kneel or vanish. I didn't know whether to feel fear or awe. Maybe both. But when she texted me, pleading, though it was more like an ultimatum, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a spark of opportunity, dangerous and intoxicating. It started with a call from my mom, which I ignored at first because my hands were still shaking. Mom's voice, usually warm and protective, sounded brittle, like it was made of glass. "Callie, it's Sylvie. She's asking for you. She's asking for something only you know. You have to help her." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. Only I knew what she wanted. It was a secret so fragile that if it ever leaked, it would burn through our family faster than gasoline in a wildfire. A secret about my brother, her father, and the hidden accounts he had been siphoning into while pretending he was bankrupt. And somehow, Sylvie had uncovered it. She had seen the papers, heard the whispered conversations, or maybe she had just always known how to dig. I could almost hear her smirk through the phone, the way she always did when she had the upper hand. My heart raced with a mixture of fear, guilt, and the first taste of something else, revenge. Not against her, not yet, but against the father who had let her inherit his recklessness while leaving the rest of us to rot. The first time I saw her after the lottery win was at her father's new penthouse apartment in downtown Milwaukee. It was obscene, the way the sunlight glinted off marble floors and glass walls, as though wealth itself was trying to blind me. Sylvie greeted me with a forced smile, and I could tell she was measuring me, weighing my loyalty against her newfound authority. "Callie," she said, her voice light but cold, "I need something only you can give me." I nodded, pretending to be calm while inside. I felt the blood rush to my ears. The secret wasn't mine to give, not really. It belonged to my father, who had passed it to me reluctantly before disappearing into the night years ago. But Sylvie's gaze held a power that was terrifying and seductive at the same time. She had always known how to twist love into leverage. And now, as she towered over me with her teenage confidence magnified by millions of dollars, I realized I had two choices: comply or watch the family I loved get erased completely. Her request was simple, almost absurd, but the implications were deadly. "I need to know where the ledger is," she said, her blue eyes fixed on mine like lasers. "I know Dad hid it somewhere, and you're the only one who can find it. If you don't—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Her smirk said it all. She could burn the family to the ground if I didn't cooperate. I wanted to scream, to run, to pull her into a hug and beg her not to do it, but I couldn't. I felt trapped in the iron grip of fate, bound by a secret I had carried for too long and a niece who had learned how to wield power like a weapon. My thoughts raced as I tried to calculate the consequences, the legalities, the emotional carnage that would follow. Every instinct told me to run, but something darker whispered to stay, to play along, to see how far this could go. I remembered the look in my brother's eyes the night he told me about the hidden accounts. He had laughed nervously, fingers trembling over his whiskey glass, as though the liquor could mask the truth he didn't want me to repeat. "Callie," he said, voice low, almost desperate. "This stays between us. No one else. Not Sylvie, not Mom, not the rest of the world. Understand?" I nodded, pretending to be shocked, while secretly promising myself I would never let this secret ruin us. And now here she was, my niece, who had inherited not only her father's cunning but also his recklessness, demanding that I hand over the map to his sins. I felt a storm rise inside me, a tempest of anger, sorrow, and something else I hadn't admitted even to myself, a desire for payback, for justice in my own way. Maybe this was the moment I had been waiting for, though I didn't realize it yet. We spent hours pacing her penthouse, going over plans and contingencies. She had spreadsheets, lists, contacts, and lawyers on speed dial. She was ruthless, precise, almost terrifying. I had to remind myself that beneath the surface, she was still a 13-year-old girl, fragile and human. But that veneer of innocence was gone, replaced by something much more potent: ambition. It scared me, but it also stirred a strange admiration. I had always wanted someone in my life who could understand the complexity of family, money, and secrets. I just hadn't imagined it would be Sylvie, and I hadn't imagined the stakes would be life-altering. By the end of the evening, she had extracted from me everything she could without forcing my hand completely, and yet I knew this was only the beginning. She was patient. She would wait. And I feared the longer I waited, the more dangerous it would become. As I drove home that night, my hands tight on the steering wheel, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red. I replayed every word, every glance, every unspoken threat. I realized that I was now part of a game I hadn't asked to play, one where the rules were written by a child with the mind of a master strategist and the wealth to back her up. I thought of my mom, who had warned me in hushed, trembling tones not to underestimate Sylvie. I thought of my brother, whose arrogance had led to this disaster. And I thought of myself, the quiet observer, suddenly thrust into the center of a storm I didn't fully understand but knew I could manipulate if I was clever enough. The secret I held was power, and power, I remembered, could be used as a weapon if you were patient enough. And I decided, in that moment, that I would not be a pawn. I would be a player. Maybe even the one who pulled the final strings. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in the apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sirens, the occasional footsteps in the hallway, felt magnified, echoing my rising panic and anticipation. I knew I had to prepare, to plan, to figure out how to survive this without losing myself. And yet, in the deepest, most terrifying part of my mind, I began to feel a dangerous thrill. Sylvie had underestimated me. She assumed fear would bend me, but what she didn't know was that fear often became fuel. I had spent years quietly watching, learning, calculating, waiting for a moment like this. And now it had arrived. I just had to decide how far I was willing to go to protect my family, my secret, and maybe even myself. The night stretched endlessly, and I realized with a cold, heavy certainty that by sunrise, nothing would ever be the same. Something had been awakened in me, something raw, relentless, and unstoppable. And Sylvie, for all her brilliance and cunning, had no idea what she had just unleashed. When I woke the next morning, my phone vibrated with a single text from Sylvie. "I know what you're hiding. Meet me, or everything ends." I stared at it, frozen, the words burning into my chest like acid. My secret, my father's sins, the ledger. Everything I had been entrusted with was now on the line. And for the first time, I felt the full weight of the game we were in. I knew that meeting her would mean stepping into a battlefield I had only glimpsed from the sidelines. And yet, a voice inside me whispered, almost laughing, almost cruel, "Maybe it's finally time for payback." I grabbed my coat, my keys, and a notebook filled with plans and half-formed ideas. Whatever happened next, I realized it would change everything. And as I walked out the door into the sharp morning air, I couldn't shake the thought that by the end of today, one person would rule, and one person would burn. The first time I realized Sylvie wasn't just smart, she was dangerous, was when she was 8. I had come over to my brother's house on a Sunday afternoon, expecting chaos. Her father, Landon Lancaster, was busy arguing with a contractor over a remodel that was already months behind schedule. The air smelled of fresh paint, sawdust, and the faint tang of stress. I found Sylvie in the corner of the living room, her small hands clutching a magnifying glass, staring at the broken hinge of the door. I smiled, thinking she was just curious. But then I noticed her notebook on the floor, filled with tiny, precise notes. Every argument her father had with the contractor was transcribed, every dollar amount, every insult, every misstep. I knelt beside her, pretending to be impressed. "You're really good at this," I whispered. She looked up, eyes wide but calculating, and said, "I like to know who's lying, Callie." Her words hit me like a cold wave. Even then, she could see through people, through the messy chaos adults called life, and she remembered every detail. I left that day with a creeping sense of unease, thinking, maybe this child is going to be trouble. I just didn't know how right I was. By the time Sylvie turned 10, she had already begun shaping the world around her with the precision of a chess master. My brother, who thought he was in control, was merely a pawn in her quiet games. I remember the day she had found a series of receipts that contradicted his stories about their finances. Instead of telling anyone, she had organized them, cross-referenced with bank statements, and confronted him quietly over dinner. I watched from the kitchen doorway as Landon's face went pale. He stammered, laughed nervously, tried to redirect the conversation, but she wouldn't let it go. "I'm not wrong," she said, calm, deadly calm. "You promised Mom you weren't spending that money. Where is it?" I realized then that Sylvie wasn't just clever. She had inherited the worst parts of her father's arrogance but combined them with a sense of justice that scared even me. She could ruin people with words, with knowledge, with her patience. And deep down, I admired her for it. But admiration came with fear. Her mother, my brother's ex-wife, had always warned me about it. "Callie, that girl. She's too aware. Too young to know what she can do, but she will figure it out. You have to be careful." I nodded, dismissing it as parental worry, but the memory lingered. Every time I saw her, I felt the weight of an intelligence far beyond her age. And when she won that lottery at 13, it didn't just amplify her power. It crystallized it. She had always observed, always remembered, and now she had the resources to act. I started piecing together how she had done it. The way she approached her winnings wasn't childish glee, it was strategy, a calculated maneuver designed to leave her father exposed and everyone else at her mercy. And she had succeeded. Meanwhile, my own life felt painfully ordinary. I had been scraping by with my bookstore job, trying to hold on to dignity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. I had friends, but not confidants. Lovers, but no one I trusted with my past. My mom called often, checking in, warning me not to be drawn too close to Sylvie's schemes. "She's brilliant, Callie, but brilliance can be dangerous," she said one night, her voice cracking over the phone. I listened quietly, swallowing my frustration. I loved my mom, but she didn't understand what it meant to be part of a storm like this. You couldn't just sit on the sidelines. You had to move, to adapt, to think 2 steps ahead. And maybe, just maybe, I had the ability to do it. I had always been the quiet one, the observer, the person who noticed what others missed. I realized now that it was time to stop observing and start acting. The ledger was more than a piece of paper. It was a key, a weapon, a curse. My father had entrusted it to me years ago, warning me never to reveal it, never to let it fall into the wrong hands. It contained the truth about hidden accounts, offshore funds, and all the ways Landon had manipulated family and money to his advantage. Sylvie didn't know everything yet, but she knew enough to put pressure on me. And I knew I had to protect it, not just for me, but for the family that still depended on it, however fractured we were. The tension gnawed at me, a mix of dread and anticipation. Every time I thought of meeting her, every time I imagined her holding me accountable for secrets I wasn't ready to share, my stomach tightened. And yet, beneath the fear, a fire was building. A fire I couldn't ignore. I decided to trace Sylvie's steps, to understand how she had uncovered the hidden accounts without revealing my awareness. I spent nights combing through old letters, financial statements, and faintly inked notes my father had left in his journals. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to form. She had a network of information, subtle and brilliant, that allowed her to see truths adults thought hidden. Every word she had ever written, every observation she had made, became a clue in her strategy. I realized that if I played my hand carefully, I could manipulate the situation in ways she didn't anticipate. I could protect the ledger, protect myself, and maybe, just maybe, teach Sylvie a lesson she wouldn't forget. But the emotional cost was heavy. I remembered my childhood, the fights, the heartbreak, the nights I had cried quietly while my brother and his daughter lived in a bubble of indulgence and ignorance. I thought of my mother, frail and stubborn, whose love for Sylvie had never waned despite the girl's cold logic. I thought of the life I might have had if my family had been kind, supportive, honest. And I felt a surge of anger, of raw, unpolished rage that demanded justice. Not just for me, but for the quiet sacrifices, the erased dreams, the forgotten voices in our family. And in that anger, I found clarity. I would not allow Sylvie to destroy us without consequence. I would play her game, but I would rewrite the rules. The first step was patience. I began planting seeds, subtle comments, questions that led her to think she was discovering things on her own. I watched her, studied her, learned her rhythm, her pauses, her tells. I had been underestimated for too long. Adults often dismissed me, my intellect hidden behind shyness, my opinions overlooked in family discussions. But Sylvie was different. She challenged everyone, questioned everything. And if I could harness her methods against her, if I could turn her brilliance into a trap, I might survive. More than survive, I might finally win. Then came the moment that changed everything. I received an envelope in the mail, no return address, just my name scrawled in a childish, perfect hand. Inside was a single photograph of me at the age of 6, holding a locket I had thought long lost, and a note. I know you hid it. I know everything. Meet me. Noon. City Park. Alone. My heart stopped. This was it, the trap, the test, or the challenge I had been waiting for. The notebook, the ledger, the secrets, the stolen past. They were all on the table now. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever happened next would set the course of our lives irreversibly. I felt the thrill, the fear, and the sharp sting of opportunity all at once. I walked to the park that day, my pulse pounding, the city around me buzzing with oblivious life. Sylvie was there, sitting on the swings, looking impossibly small and impossibly powerful at the same time. She swung gently, eyes fixed on me, a smile playing at her lips. I realized then that the battle had already begun. Not with threats, not with money, not with secrets, but with a single simple meeting. And as I approached, notebook in hand, heart hammering, I understood one brutal truth. In this game, we were both players, and only one of us would emerge unbroken. I sat on the edge of the fountain in Lincoln Park, the cold stone biting through my fingers as I clutched the notebook. Sylvie didn't flinch as I approached. She had that look, eyes wide, smile faint, but sharp, like she was already 10 moves ahead in a game I hadn't even realized we were playing. I swallowed hard, the weight of everything I had carried for years pressing on me. The ledger, my father's secret, the hidden truths about my brother. All of it was dangerous, and in Sylvie's hands, it could ignite destruction faster than I could run. You got my note, I said cautiously, sitting across from her. She nodded, swinging slightly, calm but deliberate. I knew you'd come, she said. Her tone was soft, almost innocent, but the words felt like steel. I realized then that she had mastered control over people in ways that I had only read about in spy novels, ways that left you powerless before you even understood the rules. And yet, beneath the fear, a strange sense of admiration flared in me. She was brilliant. Terrifyingly brilliant. I remembered the nights I had spent hiding in my room, listening to my father argue with my brother about money, about trust, about loyalty. My brother had always believed he was untouchable, that the past could be buried and forgotten. But I had seen it, had heard it, had written it all down in secret. The ledger had been my inheritance, a burden disguised as responsibility. And now Sylvie wanted it, demanded it, with a kind of precision and authority that left no room for negotiation. I studied her, noticing the faint lines of worry etched in her young face, the way she leaned slightly forward as though the world belonged to her but might slip away if she didn't act carefully. I realized that if I wanted to survive this game, I would have to mirror her patience, her cunning, her relentless drive. And maybe, just maybe, I could use it against her. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. I know you've been hiding things, she said. I know more than you think. If you give me what I want, we can be untouchable. But if you don't, her words trailed off, but the meaning was clear. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the familiar mix of fear and exhilaration. This wasn't just a test. It was a challenge. And in that challenge, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The rush of finally being seen, of finally being acknowledged for what I was capable of. I could protect the ledger. I realized I could play her game, but I could also reshape it. I could turn her brilliance into a trap, her ambition into a weapon for my own survival. It was a dangerous thought, but it made my pulse quicken. Maybe this was the moment I had been waiting for. The first step was subtle manipulation. I began asking questions that seemed casual, guiding Sylvie toward conclusions she thought she had reached on her own. I complimented her insights, nodded at her deductions, but planted small errors, little half-truths designed to test her assumptions. She was patient, methodical, but I could see it, the first flickers of doubt, the tiny cracks in her unshakable confidence. And I felt a thrill of power, a taste of the revenge I had been dreaming of since she had first begun tearing our family apart. It wasn't about money, not really. It was about control, about reclaiming the agency that had been stripped from me by years of secrecy, betrayal, and invisibility. And I was good at it. Maybe better than I had ever been before. As we walked through the park, I remembered my mother's warnings. "Callie," she had said, voice trembling, "don't underestimate her. She's smart, yes, but she's still a child. And children, they can be cruel without even realizing it." I had nodded, dismissing her concern at the time, but now I understood. Sylvie was cruel, but not by accident. She had learned cruelty like a craft, polishing it until it became precise, effective, and terrifyingly subtle. Every move she made had a purpose, every word calculated to elicit a reaction. And yet she was still learning. She was still vulnerable in ways I could exploit. The ledger was the key, yes, but it was also the test. If I could survive this, if I could navigate her mind, I could gain leverage beyond what she imagined. And the idea thrilled me. That evening, I returned to my small apartment, the city skyline flickering through the windows like distant stars, taunting me with possibilities. I spread out my notes, my father's journals, the faint sketches of accounts and numbers he had left behind. I mapped out Sylvie's potential moves, the angles she might take, the tactics she would likely employ. And as I did, a plan began to form, not just to protect the ledger, but to reclaim the power that had been denied me for so long. I realized that revenge wasn't about violence or confrontation. It was about understanding, about patience, about using knowledge to turn the tables in ways that left the other person blind, unprepared, and utterly vulnerable. And I had the perfect teacher in Sylvie. I remembered my brother, Landon, and the arrogance that had led to this disaster. He had spent years pretending to be untouchable, hiding his sins behind charm and bravado, assuming that no one would ever notice. But I had noticed. I had always noticed. And now, with Sylvie's ambition fueling the storm, I could finally act. I could guide the outcome, manipulate events, and perhaps even teach them both a lesson in humility, in caution, in the dangers of underestimating someone they thought was powerless. The ledger was the weapon, yes, but my mind was the battlefield. And for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. The next morning, I received another message from Sylvie, shorter this time, almost playful. "I'm watching. Don't try to hide." My pulse quickened. She was learning too, adapting, and I knew that any mistake could be catastrophic. But I also knew that I could turn her observation into advantage. I could lead her where I wanted her to go, feed her false leads, and let her own ambition blind her to the trap I was setting. The thrill of the challenge was intoxicating, and I realized that I had never felt more alive. Fear, excitement, anger, they all mixed together into a potent cocktail that sharpened my mind and my instincts. And as I prepared for our next encounter, I understood one thing clearly. This wasn't just about the ledger anymore. It was about power, control, survival. And I intended to win. Late that night, I sat in the dark, tracing the lines of my father's ledger, memorizing the accounts, the secret transactions, the hidden truths that had been buried for decades. I realized that knowledge was the real currency, more valuable than money, more dangerous than brute force. And with that knowledge, I could manipulate Sylvie, protect my family, and finally step out of the shadows. But I also knew that she would not yield easily. She was relentless, clever, and fearless in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. The game was on, and the stakes were higher than ever. And as I finally set the ledger aside, exhausted but determined, I knew one thing with certainty. Nothing, not her money, not her cunning, not the past, could stop what was coming next. The next morning, I arrived at Sylvie's new mansion on the north side of Milwaukee, my heart hammering in my chest. The gates loomed high, black iron twisting like the web she had spun around the family. I felt an odd mix of awe and disgust. $9 million had transformed her world into something unrecognizable, cold, and intimidating. Sylvie greeted me in the foyer, wearing a crisp white blouse and jeans that looked expensive even in their simplicity. She smiled, but it was that same sharp, knowing smile that made me want to both run and crawl to her at the same time. "I figured you'd come," she said, brushing past me as though she owned the air around her. She did. Every move she made screamed control, power, and the quiet patience of a predator waiting for its prey. And somehow, I wasn't scared anymore. I was calculating. She led me to a room lined with whiteboards, charts, and post-it notes in colors I couldn't even name. Lawyers' contact numbers were scribbled in one corner, bank accounts in another, and every move my brother had made in the last 5 years was meticulously documented. Sylvie had dissected him completely, leaving no flaw unnoticed. I felt a flicker of anger at my brother's arrogance. How blind he had been, how easily he had underestimated the intelligence of a child. But the anger was quickly replaced with another emotion. Opportunity. If I could play my cards right, if I could guide her just enough without revealing everything, I could take control. I could protect the ledger, protect my family, and maybe even get a taste of justice for the years we had lost. Sylvie didn't waste words. "I need to know everything you've seen, everything you remember," she said, pacing in front of the boards. I nodded slowly, pretending to consider, buying time, planting the seeds of my own plan. I let her think she was leading me, that she was drawing out the information she wanted. In reality, I was cataloging every reaction, every pause, every flicker of hesitation. Children had instincts, yes, but even the sharpest child could be manipulated with enough subtlety. And I had learned patience the hard way, hiding my intelligence, watching, waiting, learning. Sylvie had grown powerful, but she hadn't yet learned that knowledge alone was not victory, it was execution. I decided to start with a small piece of information, enough to satisfy her curiosity without endangering the ledger. "There's a box," I said carefully, choosing words that sounded hesitant but deliberate. "It's hidden, somewhere safe. Your dad never thought anyone would find it. But it exists." Her eyes lit up, sharp and calculating. "Where?" she demanded. I shook my head, feigning uncertainty, letting the tension stretch between us like a live wire. She frowned, clearly frustrated but intrigued. That was exactly the reaction I wanted. Curiosity tinged with impatience. I could almost see the wheels turning in her mind. The planning, the plotting. And I smiled inwardly, knowing that every move she made now could be anticipated, subtly guided, twisted in my favor. As the day wore on, I watched her interact with her entourage. The lawyers, the financial advisors, even the house staff. She was commanding, fearless, and precise. But she was still a child in ways she didn't realize. She fumed when someone contradicted her, but her anger was quickly replaced by calculation. She was learning boundaries, testing limits, seeking control over everything. And in that, I saw the cracks I needed. Children who believed they could dominate adults often underestimated patience, subtlety, and cunning. I had spent my life learning those lessons, and now for the first time I felt ready to use them. I could play her game, yes, but I could also reshape it entirely. Then came the subtle first victories. I began leaving small clues, intentional yet incomplete, in places I knew Sylvie would notice. A ledger page half visible, a misfiled receipt, a name crossed out but left in plain sight. She noticed, of course. Her sharp eyes caught every detail, but I guided her perception. I let her feel triumphant, thinking she had uncovered yet another hidden truth, while in reality, I was her invisible puppeteer. It was exhilarating, a heady mixture of fear, excitement, and righteous vindication. I realized that revenge wasn't about anger, it was about reclaiming control, about turning years of powerlessness into mastery, about showing the family that the quiet ones were often the most dangerous. My brother, Landon, remained oblivious. He flitted through his life with his usual arrogance, convinced that Sylvie's wealth and cunning would secure his dominance. But every move she made under my subtle influence chipped away at his illusions. He called me once that week, voice casual, unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. "Callie, you've been spending a lot of time with her lately," he said. "Be careful. Don't let her run you." I smiled faintly, hiding the storm of strategy in my mind. "I'm fine," I said, voice light, deceptively calm. "She's clever, yes, but I know how to handle her." Inside, I felt the thrill of the unseen, unspoken battle. I was no longer a passive observer. I was a player, moving pieces on a board only I fully understood. By evening, Sylvie was visibly exhausted, her usual energy tinged with frustration. I could see her impatience growing, her fingers tapping against the table as she reviewed notes, cross-referencing financial documents, planning the next steps in what she believed was her domination. I allowed her. By late afternoon, Sylvie had exhausted herself, her energy shifting from confident dominance to restless agitation. I suggested a walk around the property, under the guise of fresh air and strategy discussion. She agreed, swinging her bag across her shoulder, her gaze fixed on me like a hawk assessing prey. We moved through gardens manicured to perfection, fountains sparkling in the late sun, and I felt the thrill of the psychological duel, the subtle glances, the almost imperceptible movements, the tension that crackled between us. I knew that every word, every gesture, every slight misstep could be leveraged. And I intended to leverage everything. When we reached the edge of the property near the woods, I paused, pretending to check my phone. Sylvie leaned against a tree, scanning the horizon as if she was already envisioning a plan to dominate the entire landscape. I spoke quietly, careful to let my words hang between us. "You're brilliant," I said. "But sometimes, even brilliance misses the obvious." Her head tilted, curiosity flashing in her eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "Sometimes the thing you're looking for is right under your nose, hidden in plain sight. People miss it because they're too focused on control, too focused on winning." I let the words settle, watching her process, knowing that planting doubt was the first step in shifting the balance of power. She frowned, clearly irritated but intrigued, and I realized I had her exactly where I wanted. She believed she was in control, that she had already won. And yet, she had unknowingly stepped into a trap of my making. A web of subtle hints, false trails, and careful psychological nudges that could lead her anywhere I chose. I felt a surge of power, the same intoxicating mix of fear and exhilaration I had felt when I first realized she could destroy us. But now, I knew I could survive her brilliance, even bend it to my will. The ledger remained safe, my secrets intact, and the game had only just begun. As dusk fell and we returned to the mansion, Sylvie was restless, pacing the marble floors, reviewing her notes, muttering observations under her breath. I watched quietly, taking mental notes of her patterns, her responses, her weaknesses. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think beyond mere survival. I allowed myself to imagine revenge, not cruel or violent, but strategic, precise, and satisfying. The years of invisibility, of being underestimated, of watching my family falter while I stayed in the shadows, all of it could finally be reversed. And I felt a dark thrill, knowing that the next move could tip the balance irrevocably in my favor. That night, I returned to my apartment, exhausted but exhilarated. I laid out my plans, tracing the ledger's contents, Sylvie's patterns, and the psychological traps I could set. I knew the next meeting would be decisive. She would test me, push me, try to force my hand. But I would be ready. I would guide her, manipulate her, and protect the secret that had been entrusted to me. And perhaps if I was clever, I could teach her a lesson about respect, patience, and the power of subtlety. Lessons her father had never learned, lessons the money could never buy. Then, just as I was about to close my notebook, my phone buzzed. It was a photo, a picture of the ledger's hiding place, taken from an angle only someone inside the mansion could have seen. My stomach dropped. Sylvie had been watching me even more closely than I realized. And suddenly, I knew that the game had escalated beyond simple manipulation. She was no longer a child testing boundaries. She was a predator, and I was being forced to sharpen my claws. I stared at the photo, heart racing, realizing that the next move would change everything. And in that moment, I understood that the line between hunter and hunted had blurred, leaving only the cold certainty that in this game, only one of us could come out unbroken. The next morning, I arrived at Sylvie's mansion with a plan carefully tucked into my mind, every word, every gesture rehearsed. I carried an aura of calm, though beneath it, my pulse was a drumbeat of anticipation. Sylvie was waiting in the grand living room, papers and charts sprawled across the coffee table like a battlefield map. Her gaze locked onto mine the moment I stepped in, sharp and measuring. "I was hoping you'd come early," she said, tilting her head. I smiled faintly, letting her believe she controlled the room, the conversation, the entire dynamic between us. It was a delicate dance, allow her to feel superior, confident, untouchable, while I subtly guided her every thought, every assumption. I had learned long ago that the best power isn't shouted, it's whispered, planted like seeds that grow without notice until they bloom into control. I began by asking questions, innocuous at first, designed to see where her confidence wavered. Have you considered the possibility that not everything is as it seems? I said, carefully letting my words linger. She frowned, clearly intrigued, but her curiosity masked a simmering impatience. She wanted results, answers, victories. But I knew that impatience was her weakness, the gap between brilliance and recklessness. I let her stew in uncertainty while I subtly guided her attention to small inconsistencies in her own assumptions. Every glance, every pause, every faint flicker of hesitation was a victory. I felt my power grow, not through force, but through strategy. The kind of quiet, dangerous strength that had defined my life in the shadows of my family. By mid-afternoon, the tension in the mansion was palpable. Sylvie's entourage had retreated to give us privacy, sensing the electric war unfolding between her and me. She was relentless, questioning every lead, every theory, probing for weaknesses, yet I could see the tiny cracks forming in her armor. Her confidence was formidable, yes, but even the sharpest mind could be steered when patience was applied correctly. I began introducing subtle distractions, little pieces of misinformation designed to make her think she was discovering truths on her own. I let her chase shadows while I catalogued her responses, learning the rhythm of her brilliance and her impatience. And with every calculated move, I felt the first intoxicating stirrings of revenge. Not cruelty, but poetic justice. The ledger was never far from my mind. I knew that its secrets had the power to unravel the family completely, but I also knew that Sylvie had not yet earned them. She had skill, money, and audacity, but not patience. And patience, I realized, was the one weapon I wielded more expertly than anyone. I could guide her, manipulate her, and protect what mattered while letting her believe she was leading. I allowed myself a small, quiet satisfaction at the thought. For years, I had been the quiet observer, overlooked, underestimated, ignored. And now, for the first time, I felt seen, not by chance, but by design. Sylvie had become my unwitting teacher, my catalyst, my partner in this dangerous game. To vent, letting her believe she was in complete control, while I meticulously catalogued her moves, her tendencies, the subtle ways she let curiosity and desire for power cloud judgment. The ledger, still safely hidden, became not just a secret, but a weapon poised to shift the balance when the time was right. I could almost taste the satisfaction, the quiet thrill of knowing that Sylvie, for all her brilliance, had not yet learned the rules of subtle manipulation. And then, in the quiet hours before midnight, I received a text that made my pulse spike. I'm close. I know more than you think. Meet me tomorrow. It was from Sylvie, short, precise, dangerous. I knew immediately she had uncovered something, maybe not everything, but enough to challenge me. And in that challenge, I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. The game had escalated. The boundaries between predator and prey were shifting. And for the first time, I understood the thrill, the danger, and the intoxicating possibility of revenge fully. I could protect the ledger. I could protect my family. And I could, finally, begin to turn the tables. As I prepared for the next day, I realized that the stakes had grown higher than ever. Every step, every glance, every subtle move mattered now. Sylvie was brilliant, relentless, and fearless, but I was patient, calculating, and quietly ruthless. And in that balance of power, one thing became clear. The next encounter would change everything. Not just for me or Sylvie, but for every fractured piece of our family. And as I lay awake that night, plans swirling in my mind, I whispered to myself a dangerous, exhilarating thought. It's finally my turn to play. The morning sun cut through the blinds of my apartment like a warning. Today was different. Today, I would no longer merely observe. Today, I would act. I carried the ledger carefully in a locked folder, though Sylvie didn't know it yet. I had prepared subtle diversions, carefully planted hints, and a series of small traps designed to test her patience and judgment. I had to be precise. One wrong move, one impulsive decision on my part, and everything could spiral out of control. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain, an ordinary morning masking the storm about to unfold. I rehearsed my words quietly, tracing the sequence of the day in my mind, anticipating her reactions, imagining her confidence faltering, imagining her brilliance meeting its match. I was nervous, but not afraid. Fear was a luxury I no longer indulged. Sylvie met me at the front gate of her mansion, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp as ever. She was dressed casually, but her posture, her gaze, everything about her screamed control. "I was wondering if you'd show," she said, a faint smile brushing her lips. I nodded, stepping carefully into her world, pretending to defer to her authority while quietly setting the stage. Every smile, every pause, every casual remark was a calculated step in a delicate dance. Sylvie had always believed she was untouchable, that money and cunning could secure dominance over the rest of us. But she hadn't accounted for patience, for subtlety, for someone who had spent years watching, learning, and waiting for the right moment. That moment was now. We walked through the gardens, our conversation drifting toward finances, past secrets, and the possibilities hidden in the ledger. I let her think she was discovering things on her own, guiding her attention with careful precision. Every question I answered, every insight I feigned, was a controlled release of information designed to test her reactions. I watched her closely, noting every twitch, every hesitation, every tiny flicker of doubt. Sylvie was brilliant, yes, but brilliance could be led astray with the right nudge. I allowed myself a quiet thrill as I realized how much power subtlety held, how easily it could bend the confident, the reckless, the ambitious. And in that realization, I felt my first taste of revenge, sweet and intoxicating. By midday, Sylvie was visibly restless. She pounded her fingers against a marble table, muttering under her breath about missing leads and hidden accounts. I suggested we take a break casually, letting her imagine she was resting, while in reality, I was planting the seeds of her frustration, shaping the narrative to my advantage. "Sometimes," I said quietly, letting my voice linger, "the answers you seek aren't where you're looking. They're hidden in plain sight, overlooked because everyone is too eager to act." Her head tilted, curiosity mixing with annoyance. That was exactly the reaction I wanted. An unsettled mind is an open mind, a mind I could guide. Later, as we returned to the mansion, I carefully orchestrated a subtle revelation. A file, slightly misplaced, caught her eye. She picked it up, scanning the contents quickly, unaware that I had intentionally left it slightly misleading, enough to challenge her assumptions but not enough to endanger the ledger. Her brow furrowed, the first real crack in her otherwise unshakable confidence. I felt the thrill of control, quiet but undeniable. Sylvie, for all her brilliance, had not yet learned the lesson that adults sometimes learn too late. Patience and subtlety often outweighed raw intelligence and audacity. And I, long overlooked and underestimated, was about to teach it to her. By evening, Sylvie was exhausted, pacing the grand halls, muttering observations, analyzing data, and reviewing her discoveries. I observed quietly from a distance, noting patterns, tendencies, weaknesses. She was relentless, tireless, brilliant, but predictable. The ledger remained safe, untouched, and the web I had begun weaving around her carefully guided her movements without her realizing it. The satisfaction was intoxicating. Revenge, I realized, was not about confrontation or anger. It was about reclaiming agency, bending events to your will while leaving the other party convinced they were in control. And I was finally doing just that. Later that night, I returned to my apartment and laid out my next steps, tracing Sylvie's potential reactions, planning contingencies, preparing for unexpected moves. The tension was palpable, a heavy weight pressing against the walls of my mind. I had become a player in a dangerous game, navigating between a child who wielded money like a weapon and the fractured remnants of a family that had long underestimated me. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, driven by fear, anticipation, and the quiet thrill of revenge. And as I prepared for the next encounter, I knew one thing with certainty. The stakes were higher than ever, and only one of us would emerge unbroken. Then, just before midnight, my phone buzzed. A message, short and precise, from Sylvie. "I see through your words. I know more than you let on. Tomorrow changes everything." My pulse quickened. The game had escalated. The balance of power was shifting. And I understood clearly that this was no longer merely a battle of intelligence. It was a war of patience, cunning, and emotional endurance. And for the first time, I embraced it fully, knowing that the next day would bring the confrontation that could finally set the course for everything. Our revenge, our secrets, our family, and our survival. The day had barely begun, but I already felt the weight of it pressing down on me like the first heavy snow of winter. I knew Sylvie would be sharp, relentless, and impatient, But I also knew her brilliance had a predictable rhythm. I studied her patterns, memorized the cadence of her attention, and planned a move that could shift everything in my favor. I arrived at her mansion early, pretending casualness while my mind raced through contingencies. My hands were steady, my smile calm, but inside, the fire of revenge burned hotter than ever. Today wasn't just a test, it was the first real strike, a carefully orchestrated challenge designed to make Sylvie confront her own vulnerability for the first time. She greeted me in the foyer, her usual sharpness tempered by curiosity. "You're early," she said, eyebrows lifted. I shrugged, casually adjusting my jacket. "I wanted to get a head start," I replied lightly, letting the words linger like a shadow between us. I could see her calculating, analyzing, searching for hidden meaning where there might be none. That was the first step in my trap. Make her doubt, make her hesitate, make her believe she was losing control even when she wasn't. Sylvie had always thrived on certainty, on domination, on the power of knowledge. But even the smartest person can be led when they begin to question themselves, when they are forced to confront the possibility that they might be wrong. I led her to the study, a room filled with her meticulously organized charts and documents. "I found something you might want to see," I said casually, dropping a small, unmarked folder onto the table. She leaned over immediately, eyes narrowing, a mixture of anticipation and impatience flashing across her face. I watched every subtle reaction, the quick inhale, the slight shift in weight, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. I let her open the folder, pretending to observe, while carefully guiding the narrative in my favor. Inside were documents, hints, and half-truths. Enough to lure her, enough to excite her, but carefully incomplete. Every detail was calibrated to provoke curiosity, to nudge her toward making a decision she wouldn't fully understand. She read silently, lips moving slightly as her mind raced through possibilities. Her eyes flickered to me, searching, questioning, measuring. I let her think she was in control, that she had uncovered something profound. "What do you think?" I asked lightly, leaning back in my chair. The pause was almost unbearable, the tension thickening the air around us. It doesn't make sense," she finally said, voice sharp but tinged with uncertainty. That tiny crack in her armor made my pulse race. Sylvie's strength was in her certainty, and now doubt had begun to creep in. My heart hammered with anticipation. Every subtle gesture, every carefully planted clue, had worked perfectly. I watched her for hours, guiding her subtly, leaving faint suggestions, observing how she navigated the half-truths I had placed before her. She tried to cross-reference, to validate, to confirm, but every step led to more questions than answers. Her frustration grew, visible in the tense line of her shoulders, the restless movement of her fingers, the furrowed focus in her eyes. And I felt an exhilarating rush of control, not through force, but through psychology, through the power of perception and manipulation. Sylvie had underestimated me, and now the balance was beginning to shift. By evening, the mansion was quiet, the staff having retired, leaving just the two of us. Sylvie's energy had changed. She was no longer confidently leading, no longer entirely sure of her superiority. She was testing boundaries, probing for mistakes, scanning for traps. And yet, she hadn't realized the full extent of what I had orchestrated. I had led her into a maze of half-truths, designed to make her reveal more than she intended, to act impulsively, and to begin questioning the very assumptions that had made her feel invincible. The thrill of the psychological game was intoxicating, a mix of fear, anticipation, and quiet triumph that I hadn't felt in years. Late that night, I returned to my apartment, exhausted but exhilarated. I replayed every interaction, every reaction, every subtle cue. I had set the trap, guided her into it, and watched the first cracks appear in her armor. Sylvie, for all her brilliance and audacity, had begun to question herself for the first time, and I realized something dangerous and delicious. I was no longer the hunted. I was the strategist, the conductor, the unseen hand directing the symphony of chaos and revenge. The ledger remained safe, my family's secrets protected, and the balance of power had begun to shift in ways neither Sylvie nor Landon could anticipate. As I drifted into sleep, my mind was alive with anticipation. Tomorrow would be another challenge, another test, another opportunity to manipulate, to guide, and to reclaim what had been lost to arrogance, betrayal, and indifference. The game had escalated to a level where fear, patience, and subtlety would determine the victor. And I knew one thing with certainty. Sylvie had underestimated me, And that was a mistake she would not recover from easily. For the first time in my life, I felt the intoxicating thrill of being fully seen, fully powerful, and fully prepared to reclaim the balance that had long been stolen from me. The morning air was thick with tension as I approached Sylvie's mansion, a storm of anticipation buzzing under my skin. Today wasn't about subtle nudges or half-truths. It was about pushing boundaries, seeing how far she would go before she stumbled. I held the ledger's safe location in my mind like a secret shield, my calm exterior masking the adrenaline racing through my veins. I knew the consequences of failure, exposure, chaos, perhaps even total family collapse. But the thrill of control over this delicate web of secrets outweighed every fear. Sylvie believed she was untouchable. I intended to show her just how wrong she was. The first step was precision. Every gesture, every word, every glance had to guide her without revealing my hand. Sylvie met me in the grand living room, her posture sharp, her eyes alight with confidence. "I've been thinking about the ledger," she said casually, though the edge in her voice betrayed impatience. I nodded thoughtfully, allowing her to feel in command while subtly steering the conversation. "Sometimes," I said, careful to make my tone gentle yet deliberate, "the most important truths aren't the ones we search for, they're the ones we're given without realizing it." Her brow furrowed, curiosity mingling with irritation. That hesitation, that tiny pause, was exactly what I needed. Sylvie thrived on certainty, on immediate control. A hint of doubt was my ally, a subtle lever to tilt the power back into my hands. I guided her through the study, pointing out small discrepancies, contradictions in documents that were intentionally planted. Her eyes narrowed, scanning, analyzing, trying to see the trap before it trapped her. I let her lead herself, asking questions that seemed casual but were carefully designed to misdirect her conclusions. I could see her frustration building, visible in the tense clench of her jaw and the restless movement of her hands. The staff had left, the mansion silent except for the soft hum of late afternoon sunlight spilling through the windows. It was just the two of us, and in that quiet, I felt a powerful shift, the balance of control moving, almost imperceptibly, but unmistakably, in my favor. By late afternoon, Sylvie had begun acting impulsively, making small mistakes, revealing assumptions she hadn't realized were false. She was brilliant, yes, but brilliance without patience is a dangerous vulnerability. I let her believe she had uncovered a breakthrough, guiding her toward a partial truth, a calculated piece of information that would reveal more about her own limitations than about the ledger. I felt a dark thrill, the intoxicating mixture of fear, control, and revenge coursing through me. 4 years, I had been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. And now, with subtlety, strategy, and patience, I was reclaiming the power that had always belonged to me. The real test came when I left a small envelope on the corner of her desk, labeled only with her initials. I knew she would notice immediately, and I knew she would open it. Inside were letters and photographs, carefully selected to stir emotions, to provoke reactions, to push her toward choices she wasn't fully prepared for. She picked it up, scanning quickly, her face shifting from curiosity to confusion to frustration. I allowed myself a faint smile. Sylvie had begun to feel what I had felt for years, the weight of secrets, the tension of knowing too much but not fully controlling the outcome. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was effective. The first real cracks in her unshakable confidence had appeared. By evening, the mansion felt tense, the walls vibrating with unspoken conflict. Sylvie paced, muttering to herself, checking and rechecking notes, the energy in the room a mixture of brilliance, fear, and confusion. I observed quietly, cataloging reactions, analyzing patterns, noting weaknesses. The ledger remained safe, the secrets intact, and I realized that patience, subtlety, and careful manipulation were more powerful than money or audacity. For the first time, I felt the exhilarating thrill of controlling the narrative, guiding the predator, and shaping the outcome of a battle that had begun years before without anyone realizing it. Just as I prepared to leave, I received a message from my mother. "Callie, be careful. She's learning faster than you think." I read it, a flicker of concern passing through me, but it was overshadowed by the surge of confidence I felt. Sylvie had underestimated me, had assumed my quiet nature meant weakness. Now, the game was truly mine to guide. And I understood with cold clarity that the next confrontation would escalate further, that stakes would rise, and that the family, already fractured, would feel the ripple effects of our duel in ways none of us could predict. Late that night, alone in my apartment, I mapped out the next move. Sylvie's patterns, her impatience, her overconfidence, they were all predictable, manipulable, exploitable. I planned another subtle trap, one that would force her to make a choice revealing her vulnerabilities while leaving the ledger untouched. I felt alive, exhilarated, and dangerous. Revenge was no longer a distant fantasy. It was unfolding, slow, deliberate, inevitable. And I knew one truth with absolute certainty. When Sylvie realized she had been manipulated, the consequences would echo far beyond just the two of us. The family, our past, the secrets we had carried, it would all collide, and I would be ready. The day had barely begun when I received the first warning. A package left at my door, no sender, just a folded note in Sylvie's precise handwriting. I'm closer than you think. Today, everything changes. My pulse quickened, and a thrill of fear mixed with exhilaration surged through me. I knew she had discovered something, perhaps only a fragment of the ledger's truth, but enough to force her into action. I packed my notes, tracing my father's hidden accounts, preparing for the confrontation I had been anticipating for weeks. The morning air was crisp, sharp with the edge of impending chaos. As I approached her mansion, I could see the black iron gates glinting in the sun, ominous and commanding. Today, the subtle games would give way to direct confrontation. Today, the quiet balance would shift. And I, prepared, steady and patient, would face her head-on. Sylvie met me in the grand foyer, her expression a mixture of confidence and controlled frustration. "You've been busy," she said, voice deceptively light. Her eyes, however, betrayed tension, the careful mask of certainty wavering under the pressure of unanticipated events. I smiled faintly, letting her believe she held the upper hand. "Just preparing for the day," I said softly, deliberately casual. Every word, every pause, every subtle gesture was designed to guide her perceptions, to control the narrative while leaving her convinced she was driving it. She gestured for me to follow, her posture sharp, commanding, and I obeyed outwardly, inwardly calculating the sequence of moves I had planned. The mansion's silence, punctuated only by the faint hum of air conditioning, amplified the tension between us. I realized that today, subtlety would collide with ambition, patience with recklessness, and knowledge with desire. We entered the study, walls lined with documents, charts, and carefully organized files. I placed the ledger's folder casually on the desk, leaving it visible but locked, a silent challenge she could not yet decipher. "I think you know more than you let on," she said, pacing slightly. Her voice a mixture of accusation and curiosity. I let the words hang, watching for micro-expressions, tiny shifts in her posture that betrayed thought processes. She was calculating, relentless, but impatient. A dangerous combination. "Sometimes," I said, calm and measured, "knowledge isn't everything. Sometimes the timing, the observation, the patience, matter more than the facts themselves." Her lips pressed together, a flicker of frustration crossing her sharp gaze. I felt a rush of satisfaction. Her confidence, normally unshakable, was beginning to waver. The hunter was beginning to sense the trap. Sylvie pulled a chair closer, her hands resting on the desk, scanning the documents with intense focus. I let her think she was piecing together a breakthrough, planting small errors and deliberate gaps that would mislead her conclusions. Each small reaction, the narrowing of her eyes, the shift in weight, the tapping of her fingers, was a victory. I began guiding her, subtly, gently, toward the path I had designed. It was psychological warfare, a dance of intellect, observation, and anticipation. Sylvie, for all her brilliance, had yet to learn the power of patience and subtlety in this game. And I, long overlooked, underestimated and dismissed, had learned it through years of watching, waiting, and absorbing the mistakes of others. The thrill of control was intoxicating, more potent than money or brute force. By mid-afternoon, tensions escalated. Sylvie had become visibly restless, pacing the room, muttering under her breath, cross-referencing documents, and reviewing charts. Her brilliance was undeniable, but so was her growing frustration. I allowed her to believe she was leading, while gently nudging her toward choices that would reveal her vulnerabilities. I introduced faint inconsistencies in the documents, carefully placed hints that suggested false paths, half-truths that made her assumptions fragile. She reacted impulsively, checking and rechecking, questioning her judgment, revealing the cracks I had anticipated. The balance of power, long assumed in her favor, was beginning to tilt. And in that shift, I felt the exhilarating surge of revenge, not cruel, but precise, strategic, and inevitable. Then came the confrontation with Landon, my brother, who had been oblivious until now. He stormed into the study, frustrated and angry. "Callie! Sylvie's running wild. She's tearing everything apart. What are you doing?" I looked up calmly, noting the tension in his posture, the disbelief in his voice. "I'm managing it," I said quietly. "She's acting impulsively because she thinks she's in control. But the truth, the real power, lies elsewhere." Landon's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing his face as he realized he had been blindsided. Sylvie, meanwhile, was oblivious to the shift, absorbed in her calculations. The family dynamic was changing, cracks forming under the weight of ambition, secrecy, and the long-overdue reckoning that was now unavoidable. By evening, Sylvie had begun to confront inconsistencies I had planted. Her frustration was sharp, visible in every movement, her eyes searching for clarity. I allowed her to chase false leads, gently correcting when necessary, letting her feel the thrill of perceived discovery while subtly controlling the narrative. The tension was palpable, thick and suffocating, like storm clouds building over a city. I could feel the energy of the room vibrating with anticipation, each of us caught in a web of strategy, emotion, and unspoken threat. Sylvie had underestimated me, Landon had underestimated both of us, and the family, unaware, was being pulled into a maelstrom they couldn't yet see. Late that night, the first major revelation arrived. A carefully staged email, apparently from a financial advisor, hinted at irregularities in accounts Landon had believed secure. Sylvie pounced on it, convinced she had uncovered a breakthrough, while I quietly observed her overconfidence. Each reaction, each misstep, each assumption built into the trap I had carefully woven. I realized that revenge was no longer a private satisfaction. It was a living, breathing force shaping events, bending the ambitious and arrogant to the rhythm I dictated. Sylvie's brilliance, once untouchable, was being redirected by subtlety, patience, and calculated psychological pressure. As the night deepened, I felt the first tangible shift in our duel. Sylvie, exhausted and frustrated, had begun to doubt herself, questioning previous assumptions, second-guessing decisions she had once executed flawlessly. Landon, panicked and bewildered, started seeking guidance, unaware that the balance had already tipped. And I, quietly orchestrating the chaos, felt the intoxicating mix of control, fear, and satisfaction. The ledger remained secure, the family's secrets intact, and the psychological game I had so carefully designed was coming to fruition. The hunter had become the hunted, and the next steps promised irreversible consequences. Before leaving for the night, I received a brief text from Sylvie. "I see cracks where there shouldn't be. Tomorrow we settle this." My heart raced. She was aware, sensing the shift, but not fully understanding it. That awareness, combined with her impatience, made her predictable. And in predictability I found power. I spent hours reviewing every interaction, mapping potential reactions, planning contingencies, and anticipating moves I hadn't yet forced her to make. The storm was building, and when it broke, the family, our secrets, and Sylvie herself would feel its full force. I was ready. The game was entering its final phase. I lay awake that night, mind spinning with strategy, anticipation, and the thrill of long-awaited revenge. Every psychological maneuver, every subtle deception, every carefully planted misdirection was now converging. Sylvie's brilliance had begun to falter, Landon's arrogance had been challenged, and the family was unknowingly caught in the crossfire. I realized that this moment, this delicate, dangerous, electrifying moment, was the culmination of years of observation, patience, and planning. The final moves would decide everything, and I was prepared to execute them with precision. The ledger, the secrets, the power, they were mine to protect and wield. And when Sylvie realized she had been manipulated, the consequences would be irreversible. Tomorrow promised confrontation, exposure, and revelation. The family, fractured and blind to the dynamics at play, would finally witness the collision of ambition, strategy, and revenge. And I, having patiently orchestrated every step, would emerge unbroken, triumphant, and in control. The psychological duel had reached its climax, the stakes higher than ever, and the outcome dependent on precision, patience, and execution. I understood fully that this was the precipice, the edge of reckoning for Sylvie, for Landon, for the family, and for myself. And I embraced it, ready for the storm to arrive. The sun had barely risen when I stepped onto Sylvie's property, the mansion looming like a fortress over the city. Today would decide everything. the ledger, the family, and the delicate web of secrets that had defined our lives. I carried myself with calm purpose, every step measured, every thought deliberate. Sylvie met me at the gate, her usual confidence tempered by exhaustion, her sharp eyes scanning for hidden traps. She had grown brilliant, ruthless, and dangerous, but she had underestimated one thing: patience. Years of observing, planning, and learning had led to this moment, and I felt the quiet thrill of inevitability. The balance of power, once assumed to favor her, now teetered on the edge of revelation. We met in the study, surrounded by the familiar hum of quiet tension. Sylvie's voice was sharp, demanding, and tinged with vulnerability. "You've been holding back," she said, scanning my calm expression. I smiled faintly, letting her think she had discovered a weakness. "I've been waiting," I replied softly, "for the right moment." The ledger lay untouched on the desk, a silent prize, a temptation she had longed to claim. I guided her subtly, planting just enough truth to draw her in while keeping the most crucial details hidden. She moved impulsively, her brilliance racing ahead of her patience, revealing the cracks I had so carefully cultivated. Landon appeared suddenly, panicked and desperate, demanding answers about accounts he believed secure. Sylvie snapped at him, frustration and fear mingling, and I realized that the family's fractures had begun to widen under the weight of revelations I had orchestrated. I stepped forward, calm and deliberate, guiding them toward the truth without giving it fully away. The tension was unbearable, thick like fog, every word and gesture weighted with consequence. Sylvie, sensing the shift, finally confronted her limitations, realizing that her money and intelligence could not substitute for patience and strategy. And in that realization, the tables fully turned. I revealed the ledger's location, but only partially, allowing Sylvie a glimpse of the truth, enough to satisfy her curiosity yet not fully reveal our family's secrets. Her eyes widened in shock, realizing she had been manipulated, guided, and outmaneuvered without noticing. Landon, dumbfounded, saw the full scope of years of strategy he had ignored, arrogance exposed in an instant. The family's past mistakes, betrayals, and overlooked dynamics all collided, each revelation slicing through pride and pretense. I felt the weight of justice, quiet and precise, and the intoxicating satisfaction of finally reclaiming control. Sylvie sank into a chair, exhausted, humbled, and unexpectedly reflective. I didn't see it," she admitted, voice soft, vulnerable. I nodded, acknowledging her brilliance but reminding her subtly of her limitations. "Sometimes, the most dangerous power isn't money, or intelligence, or audacity," I said quietly. "It's patience, observation, and knowing when to act." The lesson landed, the balance restored. The family, fractured and raw, now had clarity, consequences, and accountability to navigate. And I, finally, felt the culmination of years of quiet resilience, strategy, and long-delayed justice. The day ended with a fragile peace. Sylvie and Landon retreated to reconsider, to rebuild, to face truths they had long ignored. I stood alone in the study for a moment, the ledger secure, the secrets intact, and a strange sense of calm washing over me. Revenge long imagined, had been precise, measured, and complete. I had not broken anyone with cruelty, only with strategy, patience, and the inevitability of truth. I understood now that the quiet ones, the observers, the patient, often wield the most dangerous and transformative power of all. And as the mansion settled into twilight, I felt a small thrill at knowing the story wasn't just over. It would ripple forward, lessons carried quietly through a family forever changed. I smiled faintly, a mixture of satisfaction and cautious anticipation, knowing that control had been reclaimed, secrets safeguarded, and justice, in its subtle poetic form, had finally been delivered. If you felt the tension, the thrill, and the twists with me, make sure you like this story. Share it with someone who loves suspense, and subscribe for the next dramatic tale. Stories like this live in every glance, every secret, every quiet victory. And there's more waiting, ready to thrill, shock, and captivate. Don't miss it.